Hello and welcome back to the auditorium. I'm your host, Ramel London, and we're about to start our next keynote speech, which will be led by Yochai Benkler, who is a professor and faculty co-director, Harvard Law School, and he is from Cambridge, United States of America. He will be speaking on democratic accountability and innovation, open, collaborative, and social. Please welcome Yochai Benkler to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be with you. Great to talk to you all. We all have something like this image in mind, 150 years of galloping technology, continuously increasing in speed, accelerating, and we essentially have three kinds of images in our mind. In one, we are sitting comfortably in the driver's seat. We know where we're going. Where we're going is somewhere good, like 100 years ago, the Chicago World Fair, bringing us to a greater future. More often, our sense is that we are more passengers on a train that's taking us somewhere. Perhaps we're standing outside waiting to get on. Perhaps we're already comfortable, utterly within the control of the train taking us somewhere. Sometimes we feel like we're clinging on for dear life. And sometimes it feels like the whole thing is crashing and burning on us and we're completely out of control and don't know where it's going. The critical question that we almost never ask ourselves is, why is it that some people still have to wait to get on the train while others are already safely ensconced on it? Why do trains go this way as opposed to that way? And perhaps more and most importantly, why is it that some people have a plush first class and others are barely clinging on to the outside for dear life for fear of falling? That's the question that we need to ask, particularly for cities and for people who have responsibility to govern in terms of how we think about technology. Again and again, the way you will be spoken to about technology, and I've gone and listened over the last couple of days in the agoras here in various places, will be that there's one right path. Technology comes from the outside. It's exogenous. You have no control over it. The choice you as a regulator, you as a city government have is a simple choice. Either you get efficient institutions or you get inefficient institutions. Either way, there's one right path in the market, and I've heard this, people talk about 5G or whatever it is. If you don't get with the program, you will be left behind. You have no choice. This turns out to be false. And when I say turns out, I mean as a matter of economic history, as a matter of economics, as a matter of economic geography, as a matter of social science. It is a false statement. Instead, let me spend the next 20 minutes persuading you of two propositions. The first is that a proprietary solution from a single firm is almost never the solution. Open standards, open data, and diversity, creating a diverse ecosystem, will outperform over time. Even when in the short term, it'll seem like there's a good proprietary solution. In the US, we were almost on the point of requiring electronic health records to be based on open standards in 2008, 2009. We went with the easier choice on electronic health records, and 10 years later, we're paying a price in terms of our ability to do public health research. Over the long term, open standards are better. The second is, there is no such thing as a choice on technology that is purely technical and efficiency-based. All technological choices always also involve a choice about what kind of social relations we'll have. For you as cities, as I walk around here, I see two very different images of what the city is. There's the city as an efficient mechanism for delivering services to clients, and there's the city as a political community of citizens. Neither of these ideals is purely right or wrong, but you have a choice in all the choices you're making as to where you will be on this spectrum. So we'll start with the first. In the last 25 to 30 years, there has been a dramatic transformation in the study of innovation along four discrete transitions. First, we see a move from single firm innovation or single genius innovation to networks of learning. We see a shift purely from a focus on market-based innovation to the importance of the mix of market and non-market players to innovation. Most important and dramatic, we see a shift from competition and the rational actor model to a mix between cooperation and competition, and that implies a strong move from purely property to a mix of property and commons. What does all of this mean? First of all, in economic history, we've seen since the 80s a complete rewriting of the history of industrialization, from the steam engine through Bessemer steel to heavier than air flight, the old story of the single genius, the James Watt, as the source of the innovation, to a network of learning has been complete in the rewriting of economic history. Economic geography, which is probably the most important for people in these cities. How do we get innovation clusters? How do some places become Silicon Valley or the Research Triangle or Kendall Square and others don't? Here we see very discrete event studies for Silicon Valley and Route 128, for Michigan, that clearly show that a critical feature of an innovation district is rapid knowledge flow among firms and between firms and academia and government and people outside. And regions that have legislative power, that have used stronger intellectual property to contain that, stronger trade secrets, stronger non-compete agreements, have actually seen reduced rather than increased innovation, because even though they might have increased the incentives for the one firm, they have decreased the flow of knowledge in the learning network within the region. Critically important. As network analysis developed in sociology, we were able to find more connections and focus on the connections instead of the individuals. So if you look at studies early on of the biotechnology industry, again, the use of new tools allowed us to see that the relations were more important than the individual. We've seen it in economics, in basic modeling of on the shoulders of giant effects and innovation cycles. We've seen it in absorptive capacity. And in technology, the area that I have spent most of my time on, we've seen it very powerfully in free and open source software, in commons-based peer production, as critical aspects of the entire infrastructure of the internet have been developed on a model that would have been considered impossible 20 years ago. The second set of transitions that is implied is that we move purely from focusing on market-oriented firms to the connection between market and non-market players. What are non-market players? Government, labs, schools, universities, users out in the community. That mix of players playing with market players turns out to be critically important for innovation in local communities. And the shift from a focus on a model of competition that assumes self-interested actors who act only for their own best interest turns out to be a terrible model for economic behavior. It's simply a false model of who we are as human beings, and as a false model, it has gotten bad predictions over and over again in actual markets. Turns out efficient markets are the rare exception, not the rule. Distinctly self-interested people are a large minority, but still a minority. And most importantly, when you design systems that are built to optimize for self-interested rational actors, you crowd out social motivations. You actually make it harder for people, and you make it less likely for people to actually behave in pro-social models. Which leaves us to this last, and probably the one that is most opaque to most of you, transition from property to commons and property. What am I talking about? Well, you know what property is, and primarily in this case, intellectual property is what people are talking about. For commons, we essentially have, since the mid-90s, the rise of two distinct schools. One based on the work of Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom that focuses on the fact that we have studies that for hundreds of years, communities of people, farmers, herders, fishermen, have managed themselves well using their own local knowledge and their own community knowledge to create sustainable, efficient resource management systems. And when governments came in and either tried to regulate or, and this is the critically surprising thing, or tried to create standardized property packets, the resource sets would collapse. Because there's so much local knowledge and such close relations between people who are able to govern themselves without property and without regulation, commons in this model prove to be more sustainable resource management approaches. On the other side, 20 years ago, no one would have predicted that the internet would end up being the basic architecture because it's a commons. Anybody, any packet can be sent. They're all subject to the same standard, and yet it moves. Free and open source software has now become, it's on a model of shared, non-exclusive ownership. All of the basic utilities, including the server farms that your clouds are running on, are all running on Linux. Every time you hit a web server, there's a 75, 80% probability that it's one of several open source web servers that is answering your. These are effective, mission-critical systems built on a model that was considered impermissible as a matter of mainstream economics 20 years ago. Here in this place, the place that it comes in the most jarring way is this 5G story versus Spectrum Commons. 20 years ago, when I first presented a model of how Spectrum Commons, unlicensed spectrum, could provide an open access framework for equipment manufacturers to compete with each other without having to ask permission from a carrier, people literally said to me, look, you're never going to get voice over Wi-Fi. Physics says it's impossible. And yet it moves. 10 years ago, M2M, machine-to-machine, was all the rage. We, the carriers, the next generation is going to be, we're going to go to all the verticals. Tell me you haven't heard this if you've been in a 5G presentation. We're going to go to all the verticals. We're going to go to healthcare. We're going to go to smart grids, etc. 5 years later, from when I last did this data, it turns out all of these sectors are primarily driven by companies innovating around a commons rather than exclusive. Why do you do it? You get rapid innovation cycles by diverse equipment manufacturers and service providers where open access outpaces spectrum property and carrier-centric proprietary models, except in the one critically important area of fast mobile movement, but even here on data, Wi-Fi tends to be more, has been faster. So you have reliable, long-term outcomes, and what it means practically for you is that when you say 5G, what you should be thinking about is ubiquitous sensors, ubiquitous control systems, but do I need the carrier-centric proprietary model, or will it develop on a Spectrum Commons? We'll see. You should at least be dubitante. The take-home is a simple one. Open spaces are as critical in data, information, and innovation infrastructure as they are in the built environment. Just as you wouldn't imagine a city that is malls and private walkways, and imagine that that's an attractive, commercially open, innovative city, so too you should think about data and information. Without well-defined public squares, sidewalks, streets, there is no innovative and open city. Just as we have shops next to the streets, we will also have private, but it always has to be a balance between the two. Second, the choices you make are never purely technical and efficiency-based. Remember this model that I described to you as false, that technology is exogenous, that there are only efficient and inefficient ways of doing it, and if you get it wrong, you'll fall off the tracks. Remember that? The actual model is actually much more based on feedbacks. At the same technological frontier, different ways of organizing the technological ensemble can be used in ways that result in very different social relations. By ideology here, I don't mean conservative liberal. I mean how do we understand the way the world works? Are we all selfish, or are some of us actually willing? Does it matter what we think is moral or not? That's what I mean. The way we understand the world works, the institutions, the laws, the norms, and the technology feed back to and form each other. Let me give you an example from the lowly barcode. When it was introduced, it dramatically changed the efficiencies of retail supply chains. It meant that the local knowledge that the shopkeeper had about his or her local buyers became less valuable relative to the knowledge management system that the barcode allowed, which meant you could get longer supply chains for larger organizations that had and you had essentially the emergence of retailers. But how retailers developed created fundamentally different social relations. In the US, the Walmart model of low wages, low cost, aggressive competition among suppliers with a lot of concentration of wealth in the small single firm and a lot of misery for workers and very low cost, low quality materials as consumption. Very different from the Danish model with strong relations with labor and strong relations with suppliers, or the French and British model of somewhere with somewhat relations of labor and more competition with suppliers. In each case, these models use the same technological ensemble. It's not about staying behind. But they needed to make different kinds of political alliances in order to get things like zoning for the big box store. So local politics forced a politics among the players that resulted in long-term adoption of the technological gains, but with very different social models. The same is now getting true with robots. Germany has been ahead of the US in terms of robotic density for years, and yet has not seen manufacturing employment decline. A lot of this has to do with the power of unions. We're now beginning to see the fastest growing sector in robots being cobots. And it's too soon to tell whether the story that this is now about shifting robotics to supplementing labor instead of substituting it, or whether this is just political showmanship. We'll see. I'm not telling you this is definitely a great and wonderful future. But it's sensitive. You see that technology and technology companies are sensitive to political pressures. And if the pressure point is loss of work, then the same technological ensemble can emphasize complementarities instead of substitution. That's up to us and up to the choices that we make. So if we look at this, what are we talking about? Many people are worried about platforms. You could have platforms that shape us more as consumers and vendors, but even there's a big difference between a Walmart and a farmer's market. And all of these are very different from an open square like the superblocks, where people connect with each other as neighbors, co-workers, and peers. If you think of Uber as a model, sure, there might be enormous benefits in terms of reduction of transaction costs, but only if the city comes in and asserts its authority and allows containing the regulatory avoidance, allows containing the negative externalities, can you actually be confident that what you're embracing is attractive. At the same time, carpooling has been on the decline in the US. It's still twice as many people who use carpooling as mass transit. Carpooling is a sharing economy. It's an exchange between people. And you're beginning to see apps. They're nowhere near as influential as Uber or Lyft, don't get me wrong. You're beginning to see apps that use exactly the same technological ensemble, just as we saw with the barcode, just as we can see with robots, to create genuine sharing and peer relations between neighbors, which has a completely different meaning from I'm ordering a service, and builds a community in a completely different way. You also see cities beginning to interject themselves and say, look, markets have a lot of room for relations of power. We, the city, we, the state, can come in on the side of those who have no power to help in the bargaining. So New York City just adopted a minimum wage for drivers. Bologna's just had a declaration of principles of the rights of riders. Yesterday, the Sharing Cities Alliance and Summit adopted a Sharing Cities Declaration that, again, it's not a hard and fast law, but it's a set of guidelines of how I think about a new platform that comes to town. Is it more about just creating a consumer-vendor relationship with commodified exchange, or does it actually produce something that's more like a peer-to-peer collaboration? Does it increase precarious labor, or does it offer fair wages? Is it driven by form contracts of adhesion without ability of negotiating, or is it about participatory community governance? Critically, what happens to the data? You cannot have democratic accountability without knowing who is doing what, where, and to whom with what effect, and for that you need to extract data. And then again, whether it's regulatory arbitrage or actually taking responsibility for impact. You are told again and again, efficiency and innovation force you to do this or that or the other. There's a choice between efficiency and innovation and community. It's a false choice. Just as you cannot have either commerce or community without open spaces, so too efficiency and innovation line up with community when we stop using a poor model of humanity based on the self-interested rational actor. It's not just sharing cities issue. Every single one of the sectors in this Smart City Expo is touched by this choice. We've already talked about 5G. If you look at IoT, again, who controls the data, where is it stored, what sort of access is there to it, is critical to the question of how IoT works. Do you have a project like Barcelona is presenting here with Decode that builds an ability for citizens to have data autonomy? Is it connected to an open data architecture that allows citizens to actually know what's happening and intervene? Or do you have a proprietary database that just controls it? Would you have an open data as infrastructure that anyone can use, just like the internet, just like Wi-Fi, or will only one company control? That's the critical choice. Blockchain, again, there are versions of decentralization that are about prices for everything, and versions that are genuine commons-based implementations. Don't fall for the artificial intelligence story that somehow the machine will think. It's just a complicated machine. The choices are always those made by companies and people who can be made responsible. Only transparency and auditability can assure democratic accountability in this space. There is no way to export responsibility to the ghost in the machine. It's not there. We talked a little bit about mobility. Let me say one more word about democratic accountability and governance and close. So if you look again at the system that Barcelona is presenting here in Decidim, the model of the city coming in as sufficiently close to people relative to the state or Europe or whatever it is, that provides a genuine technical platform embedded in an institutional framework with a set of practices that says, you, the citizens, are defining projects we need to do, you're discussing them, you're pulling them together, we're deciding democratically how to go and moving forward, is the kind of model I'm talking about, where the city brings its own knowledge and its own political relationship to create a technologically mediated political community, not just a client-service relationship. So to conclude, open knowledge, data, and information are as critical to the smart city as streets, sidewalks, squares, and parks are to the urban environment itself. Resist enclosure. Resist enclosure to the same extent that you would if someone told you every piece of outdoor space needs to be owned by someone. And data access and transparency are a precondition to assuring that cities remain democratically accountable and residents remain citizens. Technology is not going to run you over if you recognize these two basic facts. Open, collaborative is fundamentally more innovative, and all technological choices are social political choices about who we are together and what kind of social and political community we form. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we now have an opportunity for you to ask questions. And we're using the Slido app, so feel free to send questions here. Or alternatively, you can come up to the microphone and ask a question if you have one.
I've stumped you all.
You may well have answered everything that they wanted to know.
I aim to.
Okay. Any final chances to ask any questions? Amazing, thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. I have a question about not only then like who owns the data, but also about kind of the surveillance effect that IoT has on society. I've been a little bit struck by the lack of the conversation that's been going on here, and I was wondering if you have any insights or models or how we should be having this conversation.
I think that's in case people didn't hear, the question was how we connect what we just discussed to the question of surveillance. It is impossible to walk the halls of this expo, bump up against real-time facial recognition, integrated into, particularly integrated into police applications, and not feel palpably what it means to be in a surveillance society. Notice, though, that it's not just about government surveillance. The core model of the major platforms, be it Google, be it Facebook, is to garner as much information as possible about each of us and then target behavioral marketing to extract as much money as possible and sell that capacity to advertisers. That's the core model of surveillance capitalism. And because the technological ensemble is the same as it is with surveillance by states, we essentially see a congruence where the driving business model of the largest companies and the policing and control interests of states combine to create a genuinely dangerous surveillance environment. What does that mean, in my view, for cities that don't want to be there? That's not where they want to go. I think critically, when you are choosing technologies that will combine real-time facial recognition, algorithms to identify where people are, you're trying to do things about efficiency. You're trying to do traffic management. You're trying to do planning for where to put more sidewalks or where to close more streets. I'm not talking about cities or countries that, or companies that explicitly want to impose surveillance. There we have a different argument about what's right and wrong. I'm talking about not backing in by mistake to creating a surveillance society when all you think you're doing is providing more efficient resources. That means only getting the information you absolutely need. That means making sure that if you need to know, is this a person or a TV? There was a lovely exhibition, I can't remember where it was, that instead of giving us an individual identifier, just did general mapping of, is this a person, is this a TV screen, is this something else? So you get most of what you need, you extract the population level statistics, but you don't impose surveillance on one another. So we need to have the political conversation about surveillance. And I'm not going to stand here and argue with those who say, no, crime is a major issue and we need surveillance. That's an argument I'm happy to have on another day. All I want to do is for those of you who just want efficient use of data for planning purposes, to make sure that the smart city data collection and analysis system you adopt don't back you in by mistake into a surveillance state.
Thank you very much. We are going to leave it there. Thank you so much once again to Yochai Benkler.
Thank you.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure.